After graduating college, I was finally able to move out of my parents' house and into my own apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, just a one-bedroom unit in an older building on the outskirts of town, but it was mine, and that's all that mattered. The apartment complex was relatively quiet. Most residents were either young professionals like myself or elderly folks who'd lived there for decades. I quickly settled into a comfortable routine, working from home as a freelance graphic designer during the day and unwinding with video games or streaming shows at night. About 2 weeks after moving in, I noticed something odd. My bedroom window faced a building adjacent to mine, and through it, I could see directly into another apartment. The resident was an older man, probably in his 60s, who seemed to spend most of his time sitting by his window. At first, I thought nothing of it. Apartments are close together in the city, and occasional glimpses into neighbors' lives are unavoidable. But then I realized he was watching me, not just occasionally glancing over, but actively staring into my apartment for hours at a time. Whenever I'd look up from my desk, there he'd be, his silhouette clearly visible through the partially drawn curtains. Our eyes would meet, and instead of looking away, embarrassed like a normal person caught staring, he would maintain eye contact until I was the one who had to look away. I started keeping my blinds closed, but that didn't stop the uncomfortable feeling of being watched. Sometimes, even with the blinds fully drawn, I'd catch a slight movement at the edge where the fabric didn't quite meet the window frame, like someone was trying to peek through. One evening, after a long day of work, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to clear my head. As I exited the building and rounded the corner, I nearly collided with someone. It was him, the man from the window. He smiled at me in a way that made my skin crawl. "Nice evening for a walk," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. "You should be careful though. Not everyone around here is friendly." Before I could respond, he brushed past me and entered my building. My building, not his. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. He lived in the building next door? Why was he entering mine? When I got back to my apartment, I immediately called the building manager. I described the man and explained the situation. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry, but there's no one matching that description living in the adjacent building," the manager finally said. "In fact, the unit directly across from yours has been vacant for renovation for the past 3 months." My blood ran cold. If no one lived there, who had I been seeing in the window? And more importantly, how had they been accessing an empty apartment? The police came, but found no evidence of anyone living in or accessing the vacant unit. They suggested I might have been mistaken about which apartment I was seeing into. But I knew exactly which window had been occupied by my watching neighbor. The next day, I requested a transfer to a different unit in the complex, one that didn't face the adjacent building. The manager, sensing my distress, agreed immediately. As I was packing up my belongings, I heard a soft knock at my door. Through the peephole, I saw no one. Just as I was about to dismiss it as nothing, a small piece of paper slid under my door. I picked it up with trembling hands. On it was a crude drawing of my apartment layout, with a small X marking the spot where my bed was positioned. I moved out that same day, breaking my lease and leaving most of my furniture behind. I've since learned that 3 previous tenants of that same apartment also moved out unexpectedly, all within months of moving in. None of them ever gave a reason why. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me through my window, even though I now live on the 15th floor of a high-rise with no buildings nearby. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I'll catch a glimpse of movement outside my window. Just a shadow, really, and I'll wonder if my neighbor found me again. When Ellie and her boyfriend Marcus found the perfect house to rent in a quiet suburban neighborhood, they thought they'd finally gotten lucky. The 3-bedroom colonial was spacious, affordable, and had a large backyard. Everything they'd been looking for. The landlord, an elderly man named Mr. Peterson, seemed kind, if a bit distracted, during the showing. Haight mentioned that he'd recently converted the basement into a separate apartment with its own entrance around the back, and that another tenant would be living there. "You'll hardly know he's there," Mr. Peterson assured them. "He works nights and keeps to himself. Very quiet." Ellie and Marcus weren't thrilled about sharing the house, but the rent was too good to pass up, and they figured they'd rarely cross paths with someone on an opposite schedule. They moved in the following weekend. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. True to Mr. Peterson's word, they barely noticed their downstairs neighbor. Occasionally, they'd hear faint footsteps or the sound of a television through the floor late at night, but nothing disruptive. Then the strange incidents began. It started with food going missing from their refrigerator. So at first, they blamed each other. Marcus thought Ellie had eaten the leftover pizza, while Ellie was convinced Marcus had finished the carton of milk. But when an entire grocery bag of items disappeared the day after shopping, they knew something was wrong. "It has to be the basement guy," Marcus whispered one night. "Maybe he comes up when we're both at work." Ellie wasn't convinced. "The doors are always locked, and we'd notice if someone broke in." The missing food was odd, but what happened next was truly disturbing. Ellie started noticing that things in the house would be subtly moved or rearranged. Favorite coffee mug would be in a different cabinet. The television remote would be on the opposite end of the coffee table. A framed photo of her parents was turned slightly askew each morning. "I feel like I'm losing my mind," she confessed to Marcus. "It's like someone's been touching our things, but nothing's actually missing." Marcus suggested setting up a security camera in the living room. They installed it that weekend, positioning it to capture most of the main living area. The first night, they reviewed the footage together, fast-forwarding through hours of an empty, stilled house. Nothing. The second night, they awoke to a power outage. All the digital clocks in the house were blinking when they got up. The security camera had reset, with no footage saved. "Just a coincidence," Marcus said, but he didn't sound convinced. The final straw came about a month after they moved in. Ellie woke up in the middle of the night, needing to use the bathroom. Half asleep, she padded down the hallway in darkness. She returned to the bedroom. She glanced toward the kitchen and froze. The refrigerator door was open, casting a rectangle of pale light across the kitchen floor. And there, illuminated in the glow, was a man she'd never seen before, calmly eating leftovers straight from a container. Ellie couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The stranger looked up slowly, his eyes meeting hers. He put a finger to his lips in a shushing gesture, then smiled. It wasn't a threatening smile. Somehow, that made it worse. It was familiar, casual, as if they were roommates who often ran into each other during late-night snack runs. She backed away slowly, then ran to the bedroom and slammed the door, waking Marcus. When they cautiously emerged together 10 minutes later, the kitchen was empty. The refrigerator was closed. There was no sign anyone had been there, except for the missing leftovers and a dirty fork in the sink. They called the police immediately. The responding officers did a thorough search of the house and the basement apartment, but found no one. According to the landlord, the basement tenant had given notice and moved out over a week ago. "That's impossible," Ellie insisted. "We've been hearing him down there every night. The television, the footsteps." The officers checked the basement apartment again at her insistence. This time, they noticed something odd. The apartment wasn't actually finished. There was no bathroom, no kitchen, just a bare concrete room with some old furniture. It clearly wasn't inhabitable. Further investigation revealed that Mr. Peterson had never actually rented the basement to anyone. The space didn't meet code requirements for a living area. When confronted, the elderly landlord seemed genuinely confused. "I told you about the basement tenant as a courtesy," he said. "It's the man who lived in this house before you both. He died here, you know?" Heart attack, right in the kitchen. I assumed you'd want to know why I had to replace the flooring. Ellie and Marcus broke their lease the next day. As they were loading the last of their belongings into the moving truck, Ellie noticed something that made her blood run cold. Their bedroom window had a clear view of the driveway where their cars were usually parked, but it also provided a perfect vantage point of the basement's separate entrance, which was supposedly never used. The ground in front of that door was worn in a perfect path, as if someone had been coming and going regularly, night after night, right under their bedroom window. I've always been somewhat of a night owl. My work as a freelance editor means I often find myself most productive in the late hours when the world is quiet. So when I bought my first house, a modest 2-bedroom bungalow in a middle-class neighborhood, I was unparticularly bothered by my neighbor's unusual schedule. The woman next door, Ms. Winters, was in her early 70s and had lived in the same house for over 40 years. She was polite but reserved during our few interactions, usually just offering a tight smile and a nod when we crossed paths. What I found strange was her gardening habit. Miss Winters only tended to her garden at night. I first noticed it about 2 weeks after moving in. It was nearly midnight, and I was at my desk by the window when movement caught my eye. There she was, an elderly woman in a wide-brimmed hat and gardening gloves, methodically working the soil in her backyard by the light of a single solar-powered lamp. Night after night, I'd see her out there, sometimes digging, sometimes planting, sometimes just kneeling in the dirt for hours, completely motionless. The garden itself was unusual too. From what I could see, she didn't grow flowers or vegetables like most hobbyist gardeners. Her yard was full of strange-looking plants with dark foliage and unusual shapes. Nothing seemed to ever bloom. I mentioned this to another neighbor once, a friendly woman named Carol who lived across the street. "Okay, that's just Dorothy," Carol said with a dismissive wave. "She's always been eccentric. It's harmless though. Been doing that night gardening thing since her husband disappeared back in '82. My curiosity was piqued. Disappeared? Carol nodded. Strangest thing, they'd been married about 10 years. He was a botanist or something scientific like that. One day, he just wasn't there anymore. No note, no packed bags. His car was still in the garage. Dorothy reported him missing, but nothing ever came of it." I found myself watching Ms. Winters more closely after that conversation. Her dedication to her unusual garden was almost admirable in its consistency. Rain or shine, hot or cold, she would be out there each night, tending to her plants with meticulous care. About 3 months after I moved in, we had a particularly violent thunderstorm. I was up late, as usual, listening to the rain lash against my windows. Out of habit, I glanced toward Miss Winters' yard, expecting it to be empty for once. To my surprise, she was there, kneeling in the mud as lightning flashed overhead. But this time, she wasn't alone. Someone else was in the garden with her, a tall figure standing perfectly still among the plants. The lighting was too poor for me to make out details, but something about the figure's stillness was deeply unsettling. The next morning, I made a point of checking her garden in the daylight. The storm had done a number on the neighborhood. Branches down, garbage cans overturned, but Ms. Winters' garden looked pristine. The soil was perfectly level, not a plant out of place. No sign of the midnight visitor I'd seen. That evening, I decided to be direct. I brought over a loaf of homemade bread as a pretense and knocked on her door. Miss Winters answered after several minutes, her expression as guarded as ever. "I baked extra," I said, offering the bread. "Also, I noticed you garden at night. I'm often up late too, and I was wondering if you needed any help. That storm last night was pretty intense." Something flickered behind her eyes. "You watch me?" Her voice was low, almost accusatory. "Not intentionally." I backpedaled. "My desk faces your yard, and I sometimes see you out there when I'm working." She seemed to consider this for a moment before her face softened slightly. "The plants I grow require special care. They're very light sensitive." She accepted the bread with a nod. "Thank you for this, okay, and for your concern, but I managed just fine on my own. Always have." As she began to close the door, I blurted out, "Was there someone in your garden with you last night?" She froze, her hand tightening on the door handle. "No," she said flatly. "I'm always alone." But I could see in her eyes that she was lying. Over the next few weeks, I saw the figure in her garden several more times, always at a distance, always motionless. I became obsessed with trying to get a better look. I bought a pair of night vision binoculars, telling myself it was for bird watching. One particularly dark night, when Ms. Winters was working in a far corner of her yard, I finally got a clear view of her garden companion. It wasn't human, at least not anymore. It was a human-shaped growth, a plant of some kind that vaguely resembled a man. Where skin should have been, there was bark-like tissue. The head was a bulbous pod with indentations that suggested facial features. And most disturbing of all, it seemed to be slowly, almost imperceptibly, moving on its own. I dropped the binoculars in shock. When I picked them up again and refocused, Miss Winters was staring directly at me through my window, her expression unreadable in the darkness. The next day, I came home from grocery shopping to find a small potted plant on my doorstep. It was unlike any plant I'd ever seen, dark and oddly shaped with a small tag stuck in the soil. The tag read, "For your windowsill. He likes to watch too." I left the plant untouched and called the police, reporting my concerns about Ms. Winters and her strange gardening habits. They were dismissive, suggesting that an elderly woman's eccentric hobby was hardly cause for alarm. When I mentioned the humanoid plant, the officer on the phone audibly sighed, clearly filing me under paranoid new homeowner. That night, unable to sleep, I heard a soft scratching in my bedroom window. When I gathered the courage to look, there was nothing there except the branch of a tree that hadn't been there the day before, a tree with dark, unusual foliage. I put my house on the market the next day and moved in with a friend until it sold. The real estate agent reported that prospective buyers frequently commented on the beautiful garden next door, particularly how lush and unique the plants were. She also mentioned that Ms. Winters had been very friendly, offering cuttings from her garden to anyone who showed interest in buying my house. My home sold quickly, well above asking price. The new owners, a young couple with a passion for gardening, were thrilled to live next to someone with Ms. Winters' obvious talent for horticulture. Sometimes I think about warning them, but what would I say? It's that their elderly neighbor is growing a plant-human hybrid, a tea that her missing husband might be fertilizing her garden. Instead, I've moved to an apartment in the city. No yard, no garden, no plants allowed. Still, sometimes at night, I hear scratching at my window.